Let's end this war once and for all. After Gettysburg, the Union was still having trouble securing a decisive victory in the East, and this was bad news for Lincoln because 1864 was an election year, and Lincoln had to run again for his second term. The Confederates knew this too, and they believed they had a good shot at victory with this election. Lincoln, in the idea of emancipation, was not very popular, even in the North. The people in the North were sick and tired of this war. Robert E. Lee was hoping that if his army could just hold on till the election, the people in the North would vote Lincoln out and vote in a Southern sympathizer who may be willing to negotiate and let the Southern states go. Lincoln needed a victory, so he put his general he did not take for granted in charge of the war out east. Yep, Ulysses Simpson Grant. So Grant was put in charge, and he came up with a new strategy. They were going to continue to push the Confederacy until they had absolutely nothing left. Grant and his buddy Sherman moved south. Sherman moved from Tennessee into Atlanta, and Grant moved to attack the South, but Lee was still able to outmaneuver them and inflict heavy casualties. But this is what set Grant apart from other generals. He knew Lee was running out of men, and the North had plenty. Instead of pulling back, Grant would give the order to keep moving forward and flank Lee again and again. We have the Battle of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and in a few months, 80,000 men would be killed, wounded, or missing. Grant is labeled a butcher. But Grant could replace his losses, and Lee could not. Grant pushed Lee's army all the way back to the capital in Richmond. Grant moved in on Petersburg to cut off the city's supply line. With Sherman holding Atlanta under siege and Grant doing the same in Petersburg, it wasn't enough for Lincoln to have any hope of winning his re-election. The North was getting more and more upset about the ever-growing casualties. Lincoln's opponent in the election was Mr. Disrespectful himself, General McClellan, the man Lincoln fired. McClellan wanted to end the war, so it is possible he would have met with Jeff Davis to sign a peace treaty, which is what the Confederates were hoping for. Lincoln said it seemed exceedingly probable he would lose if a major victory did not happen. Well, Sherman was holding Atlanta for just over a month, and it had fallen when the Confederates abandoned the city. Now Northerners saw that the war was close to an end. The final results of the election were in, and Lincoln won the Electoral College in a landslide, thanks to many Union troops supporting Lincoln. At his second inauguration, he did not celebrate or gloat. Instead, he said, "Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds." To him, all Americans, North or South, will soon be fellow countrymen again. In Atlanta, Sherman removed his army from their supply line and marched through the heart of the Confederacy, where they lived off the land. They tore up railroads, burned farms, destroyed communication lines, and liberated thousands of slaves. Meanwhile, Grant was still holding out in Petersburg. The siege lasted for 292 days. And 60,000 of Lee's men deserted. Now Grant had finally broken through in Petersburg, and Richmond fell. Grant finally caught up to Lee at Appomattox courthouse. Lee's army was out of supplies, and his men were close to starving. At this point, Lee finally had to face the hard truth that it was over. "Very well. There is nothing left for me to do than to go see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." On April 9th, 1865, General Lee and Grant met in a town called Appomattox Courthouse at McLean's home. Lee arrived first. Ever the Southern gentleman, Lee was dressed in his finest uniform. 30 minutes later, Grant rides up. He is all disheveled, his clothes were wrinkled, and there was mud on his boots. They talked briefly about their time in the Mexican War. Grant was curious if Lee remembered him, but Lee sadly could not recall. It was Lee who moved the conversation back to the terms of surrender. The terms for surrender were very generous. Lincoln did not want to impose harsh terms on the Confederates. He wanted America to move on from this war. Lee was happily surprised that his army got the terms they did. The terms of surrender were, number 1, a pardon for all of Lee's soldiers. Number 2, Confederate soldiers were able to go home with all their possessions, their horses, and 3 days' worth of rations. Remember, his army was starving. Number 3, the officers were permitted to keep their sidearms, that's their smaller guns. Number 4, the Confederate army had to turn over all their rifles. And number 5, every soldier had to promise, cross their heart, hope to die, never to rebel against the United States again. Lee was prepared to hand his sword over to Grant, a symbolic gesture for any surrendering general. Grant, however, would not take it. When Lee rode off, the Union men began to cheer, but Grant quickly quieted them, and he took off his hat in respect for the Southern general, and his other officers followed. Lee told his army, "Men, we have fought this war together, and I have done the very best I could for you. But now we must say goodbye." He then took off his hat and said goodbye. Heartbroken, his soldiers went home. Lee would urge his fellow Southerners to accept defeat and unite as Americans again. Within a month, all Confederate resistance collapsed. After 4 long years, the Civil War was over. In Washington, D.C., there was rejoicing in the streets, and Lincoln ordered the band to play Dixieland, the Southern anthem.